3. Are we back online? Can you hear us? Everyone? We had some difficulties, technical difficulties here. So it didn't even start from the beginning, it wasn't. Voice.
Like it was downloaded and then stopped.
Okay. You know, it would be good to know when it stopped, so... Hello, testing 1, 2, 3. Thank you for your patience. We had some technical issues. Can you hear us? Can you please confirm that you hear us? Testing 1, 2, 3. E-democracy. Can you hear us? Can you please somebody confirm that you can hear us online? And if you can hear us clearly and loudly. Beginning.
Yeah, we can start from the beginning. I know you're online and everybody
can hear. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for your patience, everyone. I hope I will not repeat myself. Nonetheless, my name is Jordanka Tomkova. I am from Swiss-based InnovaBridge Foundation, and we are working in Ukraine in the context of the EGAP program, which is e-governance for accountability and participation. We've been working here for 2 years. And I'm very glad to be with you all through technology to talk about e-democracy today. I was asked today to speak in more general terms about the new trends and future trends of e-democracy and its development. So looking a little bit about the past, the present, and hopefully the future, or the direction that we are going in. E-democracy, you know, it's a big concept, so I will try to reduce it to a few highlight examples as different countries have experimented with different things are adopting. So I hope to cover these with you. So as I said, I will cover a bit of history, then a little bit about the definition, given that it's a loaded term and it means several different things, then the different trends. And then also to step back and see what we have learned from the various examples and pilots and experiments and uses of e-democracy tools around the world. Just so when you are designing tools that you know what mistakes to maybe avoid and how you could design your e-democracy instruments and experiences better. And at any point, I would like to say that this is hopefully an interactive discussion. So at any point, if you don't understand something or you would like to know more about, please let us know or let me know. And I will be very glad to answer it for you in the course of the presentation. And at the end, I have some questions for you in the context of Ukrainian e-democracy. So I hope this will be an interactive and interesting session. So a little bit of, starting with a little bit of history, again, I cannot reduce it. There are a lot of things that happened, but I reduced it to one slide, kind of general trends. And it evolved over time. And it's important to understand first and foremost that e-democracy is a little bit a reflection or a mirror image of what's happening offline. And we saw trends from 1960s through to 1990s. There was an emerging trends of civic participation in general in political process, or the formal political process. This is in response to people coming en masse to protest in the public domain, like let's say the anti-Vietnam War, the civil rights movement have brought it forward, that people started to engage in formal processes. Also, we saw participatory approaches as a response to decreasing voter turnout at elections. Now, this is a global phenomena. And over time, political scientists and also governments started to ask themselves a question. We see that less and less people are coming to vote, and they're becoming disengaged. They're using that as an indicator that people are becoming less interested or disengaged from political process. So it was a little bit of a, how would I say, an alarm bell to start to think how and what tools can we use to engage people more in politics. And there comes innovation and ICT, so information communication technologies, which started to emerge, let's say, of course, it came from the defense industry, then it started to be commercially applied. And in about 2000, we start to see increasing, let's say, sophistication or development or speeding up of the use of technologies in political context and social innovation. So you saw a lot of social networking, Facebook, Twitter, e-consultations, e-petitions. So a lot of new, of course, government websites, the platform approach. So we see kind of an explosion of new tools coming forward. And in parallel, the government keeps on trying to think and series of normative documents, the United Nations and also the OECD, Organizations of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is based in Paris. They launched few, I would say, milestone documents, normative documents, Citizens as Partners in 2001 and in 2003 on participation. And also the European Union passed few very important pieces of legislation, and also in 2009 came the Lisbon Treaty, which launched the proximity to the people. So closeness to the people becomes a new trend with, let's say, through government channels, and it's starting to think about, as I said, how to engage citizens more actively and in more interesting ways back into the political process. So you have this tandem. On one hand, you have new technologies developing, then you have this trend, this political trend or norm of trying to engage citizens more because they are disengaging. And you see this working hand in hand. Now, in addition to these trends, comes a few key events that I chosen 4 examples where you start to see the technologies being used by people in real everyday practice. And the first example I would like to point out to is on the picture is 2007, the Saffron Revolution, which happened in Burma. I'm not sure if some of you have heard about it or not, but essentially what happened, I mean, Burma or Myanmar was, and still is to a certain extent, a dictatorship. And there was a significant civil rights, let's say, a push by the government to limit civic freedoms and rights. And the Buddhist monks, which are a very strong part of civil society in Burma, were stepping out in the public to protest against the increasing censorship and human rights violations by the Burmese government. And it's escalated to quite a big protest. And the government came in a violent reaction to the Burmese monks on the street. And the Burmese monks use mobile technologies for the first time, using social networking sites like Twitter and Facebook, and were reporting what was happening in Burma to the world. Because the government was censoring all the formal media and was not letting media in, it was the first time to record, or let's say quite internationally recognized incident where you had the use of mobile technologies in a political setting, but at the same time being disseminated to the world, where then the rest of the media, conventional mass media, picked up also people on Facebook and started to pay closer attention to what's happening in Burma. So that was one example. The second example, a little bit different, but still showing the political use of or democratic way of using technologies, was the Obama political campaign in 2009, which launched the first precedent or trend for election campaigning through technologies. Of course, there were bits and pieces used before, but in 2009, the Obama election campaign team used it very effectively and in a very diverse ways. Firstly, it used it for crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. So it was one of the first times where you had en masse donations online for Obama's campaign. So citizens could donate, let's say, funds. So it's a democratic way, it's bottom up. It was also used for canvassing, it was also used for discussion fora. So he created a mini election campaign online and generated a lot of interest in his campaign through the use of technology. And he was known to be one of the first, let's say, very pronounced or examples of that. The third example I used is Arab Spring in Egypt, where again, new technologies were used in civic mobilization, so citizen to citizen, that they were using to mobilize each other to call for civic action on the Tahrir Square in Cairo against the government. And as you know, the government was defeated, and so there was a kind of cause and effect, use of technology, mobilizing people en masse. And we also see a very good example in your own country, in Ukraine, with the Euromaidan revolution was used in a very similar way, where people use mobile technologies, also the online Maidan, the e-Maidan for civic networking, posting news, pictures, and personal experiences. So they created a special civic space online. Again, used for democratic purposes in 3 different ways. And last example I want to use is the WikiLeaks, where, again, a very different use of technology, but again for democracy-enhancing purpose, is the WikiLeaks, which set a new precedent of very particular, let's say, group of people with very specific skills, the IT hackers, who use their skills to leak classified government information. So information that they thought was supposed to be in the public domain, in the hands of the people, and was sort of censored or was kept by the government. They leaked it in the public domain, and it created a lot of, let's say, attention, and has continually set a very strong precedent for how open information is being thought about in the public domain, this kind of government versus public information. So these are some 4 examples. Now, after that, I would like to also look at what is e-democracy, a definition. It's quite a big term. It means a lot of different things to different people, especially when you look at it from different actor perspectives. At the same time, there is some basic definition. One of the more simpler ways to define it, and logical ways, is the use of new information communication technologies, such as the internet, obviously online platforms, and increasingly mobile technologies for the purpose of strengthening democracy. And one of the three key pillars that are known to be key building blocks of democracy and good governance are transparency, accountability, and civic participation. I also added the fourth component there, deliberation and public education, because ICTs enable to show in a very powerful and visual ways information to a big audience in very effective ways. It's definitely an instrument for information dissemination and education as a result. And we see that educative components are very often added to almost all e-democracy instruments. So these four elements are the key building blocks that define where technologies and to what effect they can be used for democratic purposes to strengthen that. At the same time, I would like to point out other aspects of e-democracy that is not only about technology and instrument, but first of all, the good question is, and many social scientists, when internet came out and we started to think about internet and technology, what does it mean for political process and the democracy as such, the question still remains, are we really doing something new with technology, or is it just simply taking what we already do offline, normally face-to-face, and we simply bring it online? So there is a lot of skeptics and quite a bit of research that tends to show that people tend to emulate or repeat similar types of behavior online that they tend to already have offline. So if you are an extrovert, a person who is active politically offline, then the tendency is that you will be having similar types of activities online. You will just take it online. You will be also an extrovert and an active person online. So at the same time, there was also other types of research coming that, in fact, technology is bringing something new to the game. And one thing that is particular is that it provides 24 hours, 7 days a week access to information. It is also provides speed of information diffusion and dissemination. And especially, it has the power of one-to-many and many-to-many. Where before, in order for you to pass on certain message, you would have to say to one person, and that person would have to say. Individuals as such did not have the power to disseminate their thoughts, their ideas to a lot of people they may not necessarily know personally, and disseminate their ideas into the wider public domain. Well, with internet and with social networks and various different platforms, this is possible to actually for individuals to relate to others in very new ways in a new space. Also online, what is new is that it reduces transaction costs, especially in participation. Many times to put on things like a public hearing in a community center, you would need to advertise, you would need to create posters, you would need to create flyers, rent a venue, then probably have some coffee and so on. Bottom line, that launching participatory events offline can be costly, like conferences or public hearings or so on. Online, it tends to be, although there is some onset investment, it tends to be less expensive. The transaction costs are definitely cut. It also reduces the distance factor, and this is particularly interesting for people from rural areas, who may not necessarily be able to travel to points of information or meetings. They can follow them online through streaming or other methods, or people who are disabled or elderly who have difficulty in moving. So it is bringing something new and enabling people to engage in processes. It also enhances polylocality what we mean by that is that before a lot of messages in the public were done or packaged by the mass media or conventional media or experts. Now, with the technology, there was a kind of a democratization of civic voice. It means you or I and anybody who has access to internet and some kind of a tool for disseminating ideas can go online and say what they're thinking about a particular issue. And this creates a lot of different voices and ideas that we may not have had access to before. This is something new. And it also it's called disintermediation. It means that it removes the intermediaries between an individual and then the public domain. Again, before, a lot of what we were thinking in the political spheres about ideas that was shaping our ideas about issues, let's say ecology, political parties, or were shaped by other intermediaries, either experts, civil society, NGOs, or especially media. They were packaging ideas and information, sometimes rightly, and sometimes there was bias factor involved. What the internet provides is one of the factors that its, let's say, proponents are saying it's very positive. It allows individuals to choose themselves the information choices they have access to, and essentially form their own ideas without people packaging it for them. So the disintermediation is this direct connection through the tool, the ICT technologies. Another important thing to think about in the e-democracy context, that it is quite political culture and context specific. This is especially important when one is importing or looking at other tools, that maybe one tool working in one country does not necessarily have to work in another country exactly in the same way, because technologies are typically responses, or people are using them as in response or enhancing existing, let's say, political culture that's happening offline. One good example is maybe your own country, Ukraine, where we see, we did some research on different e-democracy instruments and the status, how many are being used and what types of instruments. And we found that majority of the instruments currently in Ukraine are still in the transparency, are addressing its transparency issues. If you look at open data, if you look at the open data agenda that's opening, the e-declarations, e-procurement like Prozoro, and then you have government websites and access to information, all are trying to enhance transparency, because a lot of information in Ukraine was often censored or kept out of the public through political interested parties, citizens. So you can see in Ukraine, this is a very good example of how technologies are increasingly being used to address a real offline problem and are just trying to help it. So that's very important to think about the political culture and context specificity of a particular country where a certain instrument is done. Also, it's very important to also think about the use of instruments, not for just using it as an instrument, but the most important thing is, what are you using the instrument for? To what effect? What is the impact factor and the impact value that you're gaining out of the instrument? It's very often that people are seduced by the instrument itself. And technology is great, but it's only a tool and a means to an end. It means it should be only used to create a better and maybe different effect than we are able to produce offline. So these are some other aspects to think about. I also looked at different ways of categorizing e-democracy instruments. You can look at instruments in different ways when they are being used. there are different stages in the political process where certain types of instruments are better fit than others. And this is especially important when you are designing instruments or thinking about as a civil society organization or as a citizen thinking about is this website useful, is this tool not useful, and so on. If you are an advisor to the government or working for government, you may want to think about the different types of tools are more effective. For example, in policy-making processes or legislation, civic education or public education and awareness building is tools such as educational platforms, civic activism, social networking is used effectively in agenda setting. You know, when there is a lot of need to discuss particularly new issues that maybe government may be launching, let's say, introduction of a new transport tax, or should we engage in a particular foreign policy activity or not. So there's a lot of discussion, and their discussion for public education instruments, platforms are more effective. While in policy formulation and decision making, you start to have more specific instruments such as e-consultations, where government can ask for specific input from citizens or from experts on a particular issue, let's say biodiversity or any kind of special issue. And in decision making, we see that what's effective there are e-voting mechanisms. You know, there are different tools out there. And in implementation, there's monitoring. So different performance tracking platforms and so on. Another way to look at it is by outcome. Again, as I said, different tools are used. For example, open data is evidently a transparency enhancing instrument. Accountability is interesting one because it can go both from government providing information in order to be accountable, as well as citizens trying to hold, or civil society trying to hold government accountable through various in Ukraine, there's a very good example, is Opora's, the deputy tracking at Verkhovna Rada, they are tracking deputies' performance. It's a very good example of an accountability tracker. Participation is petitions, for example, and civil education. You have various examples in Ukraine, such as Prometheus, or you have a skills academy to educate wider public, provide free courses on specific issues on different topics. I will skip the other one. Another thing that's very important, again, and I'm sorry I'm spending a lot of time on these conceptual issues, and I will get to the examples very, very fast, but I think it's important to anchor the topic and concept of democracy first, before starting to go into examples, to equip you or to give you some ways of thinking about democracy, not just using tools, but also how should you think critically and what kind of factors you should think about when evaluating tools. And there are some good indicators to when we end up using tools to stop and reflect. Are they getting the effect, the democratic effect that we would like? For example, asset declarations or e-declarations of parliamentarians. I don't know how many, it was like 100,000 parliamentary or public officials have used them. We saw a lot of different information coming to the public light. So what? You know, it's wonderful that the information is out there, but what can we now do as the next step? And what was the effect? What was the value added of having that information in public domain? It's a confirmation. It should be out there in the first place. So, I mean, there's, of course, different ways to look at it. But this slide in particularly is to show you some indicators how one can assess at some point in time, and look at the bigger picture of are e-democracy instruments serving us? Are we using the right instruments? And are we getting out of them what we want to get out of them? So one way is to look at the enabling environment. Are there sufficient laws and policies in a country to enable instrument formation, instrument dissemination, instrument usage? Also, what kind of instruments are institutionalized, meaning used and embedded? Is government actively using e-consultations or e-petitions? Is government actively providing systematically information online, and what kind of information? Is it user-friendly, and so on? And what types of instruments does it use? These are very good examples to tell you about the macro environment, and also the kind of effects. For example, how many laws or policies that have been created with civic input or expert input through e-consultation mechanism is a very good indicator on the use of e-democracy instruments and whether they're effective or not. So this is something to think about. On the more micro level, you see the way to measure is obviously through the number of users, and also number of NGOs that are that are trained and are effectively using e-instruments to mobilize civil society, to educate civil society and citizens, to mobilize them, and so on, and the types of solutions that are implemented through e-tools. So for example, is participatory budgeting or e-petitions creating really new projects that are beneficial for the community? So on one way, you can use an online instrument, but are you getting the effect? Again, the change, the desired outcome. So this slide kind of tells you about how to measure e-democracy. Of course, there are many more indicators. And now I will go maybe more to the practical side of things, of actual examples and the trends. So as I said, the early phases of e-democracy development was a development of individual tools. So, we started to develop websites. So that was kind of, everybody was crazy about websites and analyzing websites, what was on them, then was podcasts, video streaming and of people talking on via the website. You had e-petitions, you had e-consultations, you had e-polls, and various different instruments, open data, and so on. But they were individuals. What we see increasingly is, as we see more tools being out there in the public domain and more are being formed, we see government entities, civil society organizing them into single area. So for example, the first example is the City of Manchester. These are different portals that are combining different democratic, let's say, democracy enhancing tools in one specific area. So for example, the City of Manchester, it's not very visually sophisticated, but the logic behind this is very good and very clever. They combined, for example, they have e-polling, they have e-surveying, they have online streaming of council meetings. You can look at profiles of different politicians, election outcomes, in each of them different icons. The same thing, as you can see, is with the City of Madrid. It has several portals integrated in one umbrella portal. You have a transparency portal, an open data portal, a citizen participation portal. And this is one gateway, or e-democracy one-stop shop, where you have different tools integrated in one space. And this is a general trend, so it's making life easier for citizens to actually go and look on the democratic menu, if you will, of a city or a ministry, concentrating different types of features and participatory instruments in one place. This is definitely a new trend that's coming up. The other one in the top right corner, the blue one, is a US-based application, And this is not done by government, but it's by a civil society, by NGO, which was clever enough to create for-profit activity and has provided 3 service areas that it gives to communities or governments to help them with e-participation and budget simulation. So as you can see, it has 3 tools integrated in one portal. The first is a budget simulator, so you could actually go and look at your city's budget and play around. In Ukraine, you have several good instruments in this direction that are coming up on open budgeting stream. Then the second one is helping communities and also cities with, let's say, e-forums or discussion forums, how to organize consultations better. So an NGO has used very cleverly, it's created an instrument which is selling for profit to other entities. The last example there is EasyVote. It's from Switzerland, and it's a platform. Why I used it is that in Switzerland we have fairly advanced e-voting, let's say, agenda. We use them quite frequent, both at national level and at the cantonal level, at the oblast level, and municipal level. And this one website, it's a one-stop shop for e-voting. So it creates various tutorials, so educational features. It tells you when is the next time when an e-voting session will be held or elections will be held. It tells you different technical aspects and educational. So it's on one thematic area, but it integrates many different tools. Here are some examples, and I hope they show well on your website, because here they don't show very well. I'm not... Excuse me, there's some of them are not showing. Well, in any case, I will start before we start. So there are 4 websites on two. They're not the visuals that I would like to show you, but they're 4 examples. The first examples you see is from Montenegro, and here the general trend is towards co-creation, crowdsourcing, and mobile democracy. This is quite a loaded slide, but these are definitely trends where we start to see that there is a lot of new tools emerging for horizontal collaboration, or let's say collective intelligence, it's called. Where before we always thought in hierarchical ways that experts need to assist in solutions or creating new ideas. With the democratization, let's say, of the public sphere, increasingly we are recognizing that actually all of us, each citizen, has a voice and potentially a good idea. And when put together, we can come up with better solutions than if we are alone or experts alone. So there are a lot of new tools that are crowdsourcing ideas and are using sort of user-generated content. I know that in biology, in biochemistry, it's using for a lot of medical research, are using user-generated tracking for ecological tracking, where people are putting sensors on their own homes to help ecological NGOs to track pollution or air quality or water quality. So you have interaction also between experts and citizens in new ways through these crowdsourced platforms. Now, this is a general trend, and one very good example I'm showing is from Montenegro, which uses citizens as data collectors. And that particular instrument is exciting because it incorporates a lot of others, and it's very cleverly designed. And what happened there is that the city of Podgorica, which is a capital city of Montenegro, created a mobile application for citizens to go around in the city and notice some kind of public transgression. And public transgression or violation, if you will, that is finable, that you can actually receive a fine for. So illegal parking, waste dumps, they had like when people were not recycling when they should have. So there were different specifications on what kind of issues citizens were asked to track. The cities then collected these transgressions through citizens and fined those transgressions and generated within first 3 months 500,000 euros. That's €500,000 that the city had generated through citizens or with citizens. Now, what then the city did, it gave half of that money back to the citizen for participatory budgeting, for a citizen to decide how they wanted to use this money that they actually kind of earned through data collection, through, let's say, their own means, through mobile technology. So it's a nice circle of different instruments. Another I cannot show you is the civic hacks. It's the White House in United States and we see also a lot of governments using that, is using hackathons, but for public purposes. It means in the case of the US case that I'm using is the White House has a very strong or known e-petitions website, which you may be familiar with. And what it did, it wanted to improve the interface and provide different user experiences to the website. So it called a civic hack, a national civic hackathon, for people to create new applications through the open data that the e-petitions website had of the White House had released. So from the past and of different, let's say, e-petitions data that has been accumulated over time, the White House released it and it created a civic hackathon on that data. There were over, I think, 200 applications that formed from them and solutions. You can look at on the website about the outcomes of that. Very interesting and exciting. Again, when citizens were asked to provide solutions. You can see in the right corner there is mobile technology is increasingly used. This is e-polling in Belgium is strengthening participation, not through a platform, but directly through a mobile phone, where the city, I believe, of Brussels is asking citizens questions on various policy issues, whether they agree or don't agree, and they are giving them some also options for providing their inputs. I am so sorry about the incompatibility of this computer to not show you the visual content properly. Yeah, it's sorry about that. The other trend here is gamification and visualization. We see that increasingly e-democracy instruments are integrating or amplifying, strengthening user experience or participation experience. Through research, we see that it's not enough to have one tool. It's important to integrate tools and to make them visually interesting and interactive. People simply like to do things rather than passively listen. So these are some examples, and also gamifying. We also see if people get rewards for certain activities, they are much more likely to engage behaviorally in them or change their behavior as a result. I've seen several solutions, for example, on recycling, where a mobile application is provided to citizens and it's connected to their recycling habits, and they get rewards. If they recycle X amount of, let's say, kilograms of waste, they get rewarded, and they get bonus points and some kind of a concrete reward for that. So this was done by a city. So the city is by gamifying actually educational material, is actually is asking citizens to change their behavior in a positive way that is beneficial for the public, which is greater recycling. Here we have also a very good example, unfortunately is not shown, is the city of Zurich has released a lot of open data, among which was ecological data of the city, and there's a lot of data sets about natural aspects of the city, so trees, parks, and so on. And one of the outcomes of that open data being released is a game that was created for children, where a cartoon character was created for a mobile application, and that worm can travel throughout the city on the application in real space, in real time, and children can learn, or young people can learn about the nature that surrounds them, so what kind of trees, and then they can learn about parks and different ecological aspects. There's quite a few applications on participatory urban planning and visualizing urban planning in either participatory budgeting context or simply when cities are planning to build new structures or buildings. They are using visualization software to help citizens and experts to better see what would different options look like. And their citizens can also comment on it online or after face-to-face meetings. So that's very exciting, this urban planning through the use of technology and both face-to-face and online content. The last example is an open data portal. So we see a lot of that with, the open data agenda now really accelerating in the world. And the Dublin dashboard, what is very interesting is that apart from releasing a lot of or publishing a lot of data into the public domain, it has created a question-based structuring of the data. So rather than putting a whole bunch of data sets by ecological... Okay, there's a question. I see. Very good. So we have a question here from Artyom. Which of the indicating trends would be the most effective for Ukraine? That's a very good question. I would say for Ukraine, I see there are two, let's say. One is the tendency, as I said earlier, for transparency-oriented tools, which are typically unidirectional. It means it's just provision data and consuming that information. What I see less is government integrating or using more interactive and participation engaging instruments such as e-consultations or e-polling or engaging citizens more in policy-making processes. So one trend would be, I did not go heavy in my presentation because I was showing new trends, and e-consultations are actually not such a new trend. But in Ukraine, you can see that there is still a bit of a hole in government using instruments more proactively to interact rather than providing information. It's very good. But it would be good to create some interactive content, also making information more visually friendly. We see that a lot of, visualization, working more of visualizing and creating content on websites, making them more interesting. I see a lot of websites, very text-heavy, let's say, documents, which are, okay, the government say, or anybody can say they're in the public domain, but what can you do to analyze that information, to make it interesting for people? What are some questions, typical questions that people would ask about a particular document or set of documents? So I think for Ukraine, the next step would be to try to create more tools and to visualize, make content more people friendly and also more interactive. It's not that sophisticated, but there are a lot of different, and you have a lot of human capital in Ukraine, a lot of specialists, IT specialists, graphic designer, amazing graphic designers also. So you have the skills here. It's just a matter of connecting those skills with, let's say, the processes and also some resources for civil society and the specialists to be able to provide those services. So it's kind of connects. This is my answer to your question. Is there anybody else that would have questions related? No, we will wait. Some challenges. This is to think about when you are designing. What's very important is that there's generally a tendency that people get very seduced by instruments. They hear that somebody or civil society or in another country, somebody, a government used or civil society or private sector used some interesting instrument. Let's use it. I would be always advising to stop and think before importing any kind of instrument or designing a new one, is why you want to use a particular instrument and to what effect. Many people can use instruments or try to use instruments without really thinking through what they want out of the instrument and what it takes to get the full value out of the instrument. I give you one example, public consultations or e-consultations. Government can even launch it, and I have done some research on this. They launch it, they even created a wonderful website, they have a moderator that is moderating the discussion to get the civic inputs and ideas, let's say, on policy issues, and then they get the input from the citizens, and they did not anticipate what to do. They did not think through this process of what to do with all this civic input. How to then take this input and get some interesting or useful conclusions to create interesting inputs for the policy process, for example. The same for participatory budgeting or any kind of civic providing ideas, citizens providing ideas. It's very important to think about how you will structure the whole process. Not just putting the tool online, but how you're going to, for example, get the input to ensure that citizens are actually involved and that they are representative. The second thing, when they do give you input, how are you going to structure the various ideas that they're going to put? You can already start putting some filters, design filters or features that are going to help you to do that. And thirdly, how to give feedback also to citizens. Because many times even citizens gladly engage in online instruments, but if research shows, if they're not given the feedback or possibility or understanding that their feedback mattered, they tend to disengage. And to win them back, to gain their trust again, is much more difficult. So it's very important to fully design tools that everybody walks away happy. The government has interesting inputs and can actually organize them, and that citizen can feel not only providing those inputs, but that those inputs were actually somehow heard. And sometimes, if they're not realistic, the citizens should also hear that. The government or the moderator needs to say that not inputs, all inputs can be integrated because of budget constraints, because of time constraints, and so on. So this is just an example to show you that it's very important how you design the tools. Another tendency or challenges is that the institutional skepticism or government to have low political will to influence. From my own research, actually many parliamentarians or officials are actually interested to use the tools, but they're either scared because they don't understand it, so it's lack of understanding. Or second, some have experimented, but they did not get the result that they expected, or maybe they didn't expect a result, but basically they didn't properly do them. So many times it's not that officials don't want to use it. Of course, there are those that don't want to use it and are not interested. But many times they are, but are scared or are inexperienced, don't have the skills. So there, I would say civil society has a very important role to work with also government, to explain it to them, to show them the value, and maybe even educate them and train their staff to show them the full value of it before they make a decision whether to use or something or not. Some aspects that is also challenging is that it's not always possible to measure impact fully, because a lot of the processes are a lot of the e-democracy tools are process driven. So they link to many different things, so it's difficult to measure what exactly are you getting out of a process. That's again an important thing to think about when you're designing a tool or a process. How are you going to evaluate it to be satisfied or not, to meeting your benchmark or not? So here are some lessons learned. I already maybe covered them already. So back office also is very important as the interface. Many people just think if we do fantastic design of a website, let's say the visual design, that's where our job is over. But it's also very important to think about the behind the scenes and the after, let's say, launching the tool. How are you going to work with the inputs? How are you going to provide the feedback, as I mentioned already? Supporting role of the media is very important. So creating also partnerships in communities is very important to make e-democracy tools and practice sustainable. A lot of the times people also think if they put on a participatory website or a feature on a website that people will simply immediately come. That's rarely the case. So in e-democracy, as actually with commercial products, you almost have to apply same types of marketing strategies as you would in a commercial product, because people just by themselves do not know that it's online. So you need to bring them online. And media often can be very useful in that, social networking sites. So using very creative ways to reach out to citizens to inform them that actually you have a new tool to offer to them. It's very important, because if you don't have the users, your tool will not be used. And lastly, it's important to think about e-inclusion. How can you ensure that you are not just mobilizing people who are already active, that you're actually bringing people and making it interesting for people who would not typically get involved. That's the whole idea also about e-democracy, to include as many people as possible in a process. So how can you ensure that the elderly are included, that that people from remote rural areas are included? It takes a little bit of more thought process and design factors, but it's very important to think about that you're not excluding everybody, other people out of, or some groups out of your designs. So we are at the end of our presentation. Now I would like to turn it to Ukraine and ask you which example did you find most interesting and why? And can you provide some Ukrainian examples? There is already one question from Yuri. And he's asking, could you provide some tips for people in usage of e-democracy instruments to be involved in decision-making processes? Okay. One good example is, it's e-voting mechanisms. And mobile enhanced. There are several cities, especially at city level. It's of course it's been done at national level as well, but city levels are very interesting because it's more manageable. It's on a more smaller scale, and the applications are easier to to do. For example, City of Madrid created the e-Participa project. It was one of the, let's say, first e-voting projects at municipal level in Europe, and they were very successful with it. And essentially what they did, they created a mobile app for their city council meetings. So every time there was a decision being made on adoption of a particular legislation, on citizen-interested, let's say, citizen-focused, let's say, content, people could vote in real time through their mobile applications. And there was, when the decisions of the council came, there would be like citizens' voice, like people's choice, people's voting for that. So it got a weight. The citizens' input got a weight into final decision making. This is one example. And in decision-making processes, what's important to understand there is that most important first is transparency. And one is limited a little bit with the types of tools you can use, because there the formal process takes over. Usually the decision is in the hands of the government. So it's actually government that needs to adopt decisions. But what's very important that they make informed decisions and legitimate decisions that reflect the the vision and interests and needs of the citizens. So apart from e-voting mechanisms in decision making, you don't have so much leverage. You, of course, have participatory budgeting is maybe another example where decisions are also being made. So I guess it depends how you define decision making. So in participatory budgeting, you can obviously help with prioritization. Platforms could help that, provide you ranking mechanisms, how citizens can help to then choose different options in some kind of a systematic and structured way. So this is another example of, let's say, a decision-making device. But again, so this is more civic platform, and it could be also on a government platform. But in formal decision-making processes, it's typically the government that, is a little bit takes over, and citizen has less input there. So it's very important that also the other parts is agenda setting and policy formulation stages, that across all of those already citizens' input is provided. Are there any other questions? Well, if there aren't, I encourage you to walk away now and maybe look at those examples. We will provide you with links, and maybe we can provide also after this presentation a slide of other types of interesting links that you can take a look at for future inspiration, for you to create and design your own e-democracy instruments, or combine existing instruments that are already in Ukraine. Because I think this is a very exciting area, and a lot is happening. Of course, a lot more can happen, but there needs to be much more social innovation and getting tools out there. So I encourage you to walk away and think about some ideas. What would you change in your community concretely? And the more concrete you are, the better, and how. And maybe start looking at some opportunities that could provide you resources to implement that idea. Maybe you can even create a discussion platform for social innovation in your city, where that could be a starting point. So you could already start discussing ideas on what to do, what kind of e-democracy product to design or co-create together, co-design together. So I will end at that, unless there are still questions. So thank you very much for sticking with us.